The ancient dragon Vorthak sat alone in his crystal chamber, watching another young prince turn to ash before his massive claws. Prince Alexander had lasted barely 3 seconds longer than the others. His expensive armor, worth more than most planets, now lay scattered like broken toys across the obsidian floor. Commander Williams swept up the remains with practiced efficiency. After 200 years of this same ritual, he no longer bothered learning the candidates' names. They all ended the same way, reduced to nothing but dust and disappointment. The dragon's yellow eyes burned with the same cold fire they had shown for centuries, unmoved by yet another failure. Down in the council chambers far below, elderly rulers from across the galaxy gathered around their floating table of holographic displays. Their faces showed deep worry lines that seemed to grow deeper each year. Emperor Cain slammed his fist against the marble surface, causing ripples to spread across the projected star maps. 3,000 years our families have ruled through the dragon's power, he growled, his voice echoing off the golden walls. Now we face extinction because none of our children can pass this simple test. Simple test. The other council members exchanged knowing looks. Nothing about bonding with an ancient cosmic dragon was simple. Vorthak had been old when their ancestors first discovered him floating in the void between stars, his massive form drifting through asteroid fields like a living mountain. The original emperor had somehow convinced the dragon to form their sacred pact, though the exact details of that first meeting had been lost to time. Lady Nicole adjusted her silk robes and pulled up the latest reports on her personal display screen. The numbers painted a grim picture across the holographic charts floating before her. 47 candidates this year alone, she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. From the finest families across our territories. Each one trained from birth, enhanced with the best technology our scientists could provide. And still. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room knew how those 47 attempts had ended. The dragon's chamber had seen more ashes this year than in the previous 5 years combined. Something had changed in recent decades. Vorthak's patience, never abundant to begin with, seemed to be wearing thin. General Jackson leaned back in his floating chair, studying the tactical displays that showed their military strength across the galaxy. Even with their vast fleets and advanced weapons, everyone knew the truth. Their power ultimately came from the dragon's bond with their ruling bloodlines. Without that connection, they were just another collection of squabbling worlds in an already chaotic universe. The outer colonies are starting to ask questions, he reported grimly. When news spreads that we can't produce a viable heir, rebellions will follow. Some systems are already testing our response times, probing for weaknesses. The dragon's power wasn't just symbolic. Through the mystical bond, each emperor gained access to Vorthak's cosmic awareness, the ability to sense threats across vast distances, to coordinate defenses on multiple worlds simultaneously, and most importantly, to command respect through the mere knowledge that an ancient cosmic entity stood behind their authority. Admiral Davis pulled up star charts showing their most recent military engagements. Red markers indicated growing unrest in 17 different sectors. Pirates are getting bolder, she noted, pointing to clusters of attack reports. Trade routes that have been safe for generations are now requiring armed escorts. Word is spreading that our strength comes from tradition rather than current reality. Back in the crystal chamber, Vorthak shifted his massive form, causing tremors that shook the entire spire. His thoughts, when they occasionally touched the minds of the council members far below, carried centuries of accumulated boredom and growing irritation. The candidates brought before him had become increasingly similar over the generations, pampered children of privilege who approached him with demands rather than respect. Each noble family spent fortunes preparing their heirs for the trial. They hired the finest tutors, installed expensive cybernetic enhancements, and subjected their children to years of brutal training regimens designed to forge perfect warriors. Yet somehow, all this preparation seemed to make the candidates less appealing to the ancient dragon, not more. The pattern had become predictable. Young nobles would stride into his chamber with confidence built on a lifetime of being told they were special. They would recite prepared speeches about their worthiness, demonstrate their enhanced abilities, and make elaborate promises about how they would use the dragon's power to expand the empire's glory. Then they would extend their hands, expecting Vorthak to accept their bond as previous generations had done. Instead, they found only death. The dragon's rejection came swift and absolute, leaving nothing but silence and ash where moments before had stood the supposed future of galactic civilization. The metal corridors of Kepler Station echoed with the sound of clanging machinery and distant arguments. In the depths of the scrap yards, 12-year-old Jalen crouched beside a broken mining laser, his small hands working carefully to replace its damaged power coupling. Sparks flew as he connected the salvaged parts, illuminating his dirt-streaked face in brief flashes of blue light. "Kid, you better have that thing working by morning," growled Supervisor Brooks from across the yard. The man's cybernetic eye glowed red as he scanned the repair work assignments on his tablet. "The Nexus Corporation boys are coming to inspect our equipment, and they don't like seeing broken gear." Jalen nodded without looking up from his work. He'd learned years ago that drawing attention to himself rarely ended well. The mining station operated on a simple rule: everyone had to earn their keep or find themselves floating in the vacuum of space. At 12, he was already one of their most skilled repair technicians, though he received barely enough food credits to survive. The orphanage that had raised him until age 8 had been shut down due to budget constraints, leaving dozens of children to fend for themselves on the harsh frontier station. Most had been shipped off to labor camps on distant worlds. Jalen had avoided that fate only because his foster guardian, Old Pete, had claimed him as an indentured worker before the authorities could process his transfer. Old Pete wasn't a cruel man, just a desperate one. The former mining engineer had lost his legs in an equipment accident years earlier and struggled to maintain his repair shop on his disability pension. Taking in Jalen had been as much about survival as charity. The boy's quick hands and intuitive understanding of machinery kept the business running when Pete's prosthetic legs couldn't handle the physical demands of crawling through tight spaces. The repair work that day involved fixing a massive ore processor that had been damaged in a cave-in on the asteroid's mining level. Jalen squeezed through narrow maintenance shafts that adult workers couldn't navigate, replacing burned circuits and realigning power conduits with practiced efficiency. His small size, which made him an easy target for bullies, proved invaluable when dealing with complex mechanical systems. As he worked, Jalen noticed something unusual in the machine's damage patterns. The failure hadn't been caused by the cave-in, as the reports claimed. Someone had deliberately sabotaged the processor's safety systems, probably to collect insurance money while blaming the incident on geological instability. He made a mental note but said nothing. On Kepler Station, asking too many questions could be dangerous. That evening, as Jalen cleaned his tools in the shop's back room, an unexpected visitor arrived. Commander Rodriguez of the Imperial Recruitment Division stepped through the door, her polished uniform looking completely out of place among the greasy machinery and spare parts. Old Pete hobbled out from behind the counter, his prosthetic legs whirring softly as he moved. "We're looking for unconventional candidates," the commander announced without preamble. Her eyes scanned the cluttered workshop with barely concealed distaste. "The traditional selection process has proven inadequate. We need individuals with unique skill sets and strong survival instincts." Old Pete's weathered face showed confusion. This is just a repair shop. We don't train soldiers or nobles here." Commander Rodriguez pulled up a holographic display from her wrist device, showing Jalen's work records and psychological profile. The data had been compiled from security cameras and productivity reports throughout the station. The boy shows exceptional mechanical aptitude and problem-solving abilities under pressure. More importantly, he survived conditions that would break most adults. Jalen continued cleaning his tools, pretending not to listen to the conversation happening around him. He'd learned to make himself invisible when adults discussed his future. It was usually safer that way. "The position offers full citizenship in the core worlds," Rodriguez continued, her voice taking on a sales pitch tone. "Educational opportunities, medical care, guaranteed housing. All we ask is participation in a single trial. If he succeeds, he'll never want for anything again. If he fails..." She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the recycled air of the workshop. Old Pete's eyes darted nervously between the commander and Jalen, calculations running behind his tired expression. The gambling debts he'd accumulated at the station's underground card games had been growing larger each month, and the loan sharks were becoming less patient about payment schedules. "How much?" Pete asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the workshop's humming ventilation systems. The number Rodriguez quoted made the old man's eyes widen in shock. It was enough to pay off his debts, buy new prosthetics, and maybe even purchase passage to a retirement colony in the inner systems. For Jalen, it represented something else entirely, a chance to leave behind the endless cycle of survival that defined life on the frontier. The transport ship shuddered as it entered the atmosphere of Pyros Prime, its hull groaning against the planet's violent winds. Jalen pressed his face against the small porthole, watching rivers of lava snake across the volcanic landscape below. The crimson spire rose from the center of it all like a massive red needle piercing the smoky sky, its crystalline surface reflecting the glow of a dozen active volcanoes. Inside the passenger compartment, the remaining noble candidates sat in uncomfortable silence. Lady Zara of the Diamond Courts adjusted her plasma sword for the 100th time, its energy field humming softly in its sheath. Prince Devon checked his cybernetic implants, running diagnostics on the neural enhancers that had cost his family more credits than most worlds produced in a year. They all stared at Jalen with barely concealed disgust. His patched clothes and calloused hands marked him as someone who didn't belong in their refined company. Prince Trevor whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "They're really scraping the bottom now, aren't they? Bringing scrapyard rats to face the eternal dragon." Jalen ignored the comments and focused on his toolkit, checking each tool carefully. The other candidates had brought weapons forged from rare metals and armor embedded with protective crystals. All he had were the simple repair tools that had kept him alive on Kepler Station. Somehow, they felt more honest than all the expensive gear surrounding him. The ship's captain, a grizzled veteran named Hayes, announced their descent over the intercom. His voice carried the weight of someone who had made this journey many times before. Final approach to the Crimson Spire. Remember, candidates, once you enter the Dragon's Chamber, there's no turning back. The trial ends with bonding or death. No exceptions, no second chances. As they disembarked onto the landing platform, the heat hit them like a physical blow. Even through the environmental suits, the temperature was almost unbearable. Volcanic gases swirled around the spire's base, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made breathing difficult despite their oxygen supplies. The Crimson Spire stretched impossibly high above them, its red crystal walls pulsing within a light. Ancient runes covered every surface, written in languages that predated most galactic civilizations. Guard Captain Foster led them through the entrance, past chambers filled with the petrified remains of previous candidates. Some had been turned to stone, others reduced to skeletal fragments, all frozen in their final moments of terror. "The dragon sees everything," Foster explained as they climbed the spiral staircase that wound around the spire's interior. "Your thoughts, your fears, your deepest motivations. He's older than our entire civilization and has little patience for lies or weakness." The noble candidates moved with practiced confidence, their enhanced reflexes and combat training evident in every step. They had spent years preparing for this moment, studying ancient texts about dragon psychology and practicing meditation techniques designed to project strength and worthiness. Their tutors had filled their heads with strategies for impressing cosmic entities and theories about what the dragon valued most in potential partners. Jalen climbed quietly behind them, his mind focused on the mechanical sounds echoing through the spire's walls. Somewhere in the distance, massive gears turned and hydraulic systems hissed, maintaining the ancient structure's environmental controls. Even in this mystical place, someone had to keep the machinery running. At the spire's peak, enormous crystal doors slowly ground open, revealing the dragon's chamber beyond. The space was vast enough to hold a small city, its ceiling lost in shadows high above. Crystalline formations jutted from every surface, some glowing with their own inner light, others reflecting the flickering flames that danced along the walls without any visible fuel source. And there, coiled in the center of it all, was Vorthak the Eternal. The dragon's size defied comprehension. His obsidian scales caught and reflected light like black mirrors, each one larger than a human being. His massive head rested on claws that could crush starships, while his eyes burned with the light of dying suns. When he breathed, the entire chamber seemed to pulse with ancient power. The moment Jalen stepped through the doorway, Vorthak's attention locked onto him like a targeting system. The dragon's voice exploded through his mind without warning, a psychic roar that felt like standing inside a collapsing star. Pain shot through Jalen's skull as alien thoughts crashed against his consciousness, carrying the weight of millennia of accumulated rage and disappointment. Images flooded his mind, centuries of arrogant nobles approaching the dragon with demands and expectations, treating him like a tool to be claimed rather than a being to be respected. He saw the original binding ritual, the magical chains that grew stronger with each generation, trapping Vorthak in an endless cycle of evaluating those who sought to use his power for their own glory. The other candidates had prepared for many things, but none had been ready for the raw emotional storm that was Vorthak's true nature. His anger wasn't the simple rage of a beast, it was the complex fury of an ancient intelligence that had been betrayed, imprisoned, and reduced to a prize to be won by those who saw him as nothing more than a means to power. The psychic storm raging through Jalen's mind gradually began to settle, like static clearing from a broken radio. While the other candidates had either fled in terror or collapsed under the weight of Vorthak's mental assault, Jalen remained standing. Not because he was stronger than the others, but because he recognized something familiar in the dragon's overwhelming emotions. Pain. Deep, aching loneliness that felt like being trapped in a machine that never stopped running. Jalen had felt that same crushing isolation during his years on Kepler Station, working endless hours in the repair bays while watching ships come and go through the station's viewports. He knew what it was like to be valued only for what you could do, never for who you were. The dragon's rage wasn't really anger at all, it was the desperate cry of someone who had been used and forgotten for so long that fury had become his only companion. "You're tired," Jalen said quietly, his voice barely audible in the vast chamber. The words seemed to hang in the air like drops of water in zero gravity. Vorthak's massive head turned toward him, ancient eyes narrowing with something that might have been surprise. The dragon had expected another speech about worthiness, another demand for power wrapped in pretty words about destiny and honor. Instead, this small human child was talking to him like he was a person, not a prize. Through their mental connection, Jalen began to see fragments of Vorthak's memories. The dragon hadn't always lived in this crystal prison. Once, he had soared freely through the void between stars, part of a species that traveled the galaxy as explorers and teachers. They had been called the Star Shepherds, ancient beings who helped young civilizations learn to reach beyond their home worlds. The images were beautiful and heartbreaking. Vorthak flying alongside others of his kind through nebulae that painted space in colors that had no names. They communicated through shared thoughts and emotions, building relationships that spanned millennia. Their purpose wasn't conquest or control, but understanding and growth. Then came the darker memories. The first Emperor Constantine, desperate to unite the warring human colonies under a single banner, had discovered Vorthak during one of the dragon's solitary journeys. The Emperor had been clever, approaching not with threats but with promises of partnership. He spoke of bringing peace to the galaxy, of ending the conflicts that were tearing human civilization apart. But Constantine had lied. The partnership was actually an elaborate magical trap, binding Vorthak to serve the imperial bloodline through a ritual that grew stronger with each passing generation. The dragon found himself locked in the Crimson Spire, forced to evaluate potential rulers who saw him as nothing more than a tool for maintaining their power. "They tricked you," Jalen said, settling down on the crystal floor as if he were back in old Pete's workshop, working on a difficult repair. "Made you think you were helping, but really they just wanted to use you." The dragon's massive form shifted, causing small tremors throughout the chamber. For the first time in centuries, someone understood. The noble candidates who came before him always focused on their own worthiness, their own destinies, their own grand plans for ruling the galaxy. None had ever bothered to ask what Vorthak wanted or how he felt about his situation. Through their deepening connection, Jalen learned more about the binding ritual. Each time a new emperor bonded with Vorthak, the magical chains grew tighter. The dragon's free will became more restricted, his ability to refuse candidates more limited. He was slowly being transformed from a thinking being into a living tool, and he knew it. "The machine's breaking down," Jalen observed, using the mechanical metaphors that made sense to him. "Every time someone new connects to it, the pressure builds up more. And you can't turn it off because you're stuck inside it." Vorthak's mental voice, when it came, was softer than before. Not the psychic roar that had driven other candidates to madness, but something closer to a whisper. "You see the trap," he said, his thoughts carrying wonder alongside the eternal sadness. "You understand what they have done." Jalen nodded, running his hands over the crystal floor as if examining its structure. The entire chamber was part of the binding system, he realized. The crystalline formations weren't just decoration, they were components in a massive magical machine designed to channel and control the dragon's power. Every surface was covered in microscopic runes that pulsed with energy, creating a prison that was as beautiful as it was cruel. "I've seen machines like this before," Jalen said, thinking of the automated systems on Kepler Station that kept workers trapped in endless cycles of labor. The people who built it made it look like it was helping everyone, but really it just helped them stay in control. The dragon's ancient eyes reflected something that might have been hope. In all his centuries of captivity, no one had ever offered him understanding without demanding something in return. This strange human child wasn't asking for power or glory. He was simply acknowledging Vorthak's pain and recognizing the injustice of his situation. For the first time since his imprisonment began, Vorthak felt truly seen. The crystal chamber fell silent as Jalen and Vorthak looked at each other across the vast space that separated them. The dragon's massive form seemed less threatening now, more like a wounded giant than a terrifying beast. The boy could feel the ancient creature's confusion through their mental link. After millennia of rejection and anger, someone was finally offering genuine compassion. "What do you want from me?" Vorthak asked, his mental voice carrying the weight of countless disappointments. Every candidate before had wanted something: power, wealth, control over the galaxy's vast territories. The dragon had learned to expect demands wrapped in pretty speeches about destiny and divine right. Jalen stood up slowly, brushing crystal dust from his patched clothes. His answer came without hesitation, spoken with the simple honesty of someone who had never learned to lie for personal gain. I want you to be free. The words hit Vorthak like a physical blow. In 3,000 years of imprisonment, no one had ever said those words to him. The dragon's massive head lifted, ancient eyes widening as he tried to process what he had just heard. Freedom wasn't something he had dared to hope for in centuries. You don't want to rule the empire? Vorthak asked, genuinely puzzled. The entire system was built around this exchange, the dragon's power for a human's leadership. It was the foundation of galactic civilization as they knew it. Jalen shook his head, looking around at the crystal prison that held them both. I've seen what ruling does to people. They start thinking they own everything and everyone around them. That's not what I want. Through their deepening connection, the dragon began to understand this strange human child. Jalen had grown up in the gaps between power structures, surviving in the spaces that those in control forgot about. He had learned to fix broken things not to gain authority over them, but because fixing things was simply the right thing to do. As their bond strengthened, something unprecedented began to happen. Instead of the usual ritual where the dragon's power flowed into a new emperor, something else entirely took place. The magical chains that had bound Vorthak for millennia began to weaken, not through force or clever manipulation, but through genuine mutual understanding and respect. The crystalline walls of the chamber started to crack. The binding runes that had pulsed with controlling energy for thousands of years flickered and went dark one by one. The entire magical machine that had kept Vorthak imprisoned was breaking down, not because someone was attacking it, but because its fundamental premise, that the dragon could be owned, was being rejected by both parties. Down in the council chambers, alarms began blaring as monitoring systems detected the massive energy fluctuations coming from the spire's peak. Emperor Kane stared at his displays in horror as readings showed the binding ritual collapsing completely. What's happening up there? He shouted, but none of his advisors could provide answers. In the crystal chamber, Vorthak felt something he hadn't experienced in millennia: choice. For the first time since his capture, he could make a decision based on what he wanted rather than what the magical bindings forced him to do. The feeling was overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once. If I'm free, the dragon said slowly, I could leave this place. I could return to the stars. Jalen nodded, understanding what that meant. You could. You should, if that's what makes you happy. But Vorthak realized something else as he looked at this remarkable human child. His freedom didn't have to mean abandonment of those who needed help. The original Star Shepherds had been teachers and protectors, not rulers. Perhaps he could reclaim that purpose, but this time through partnership rather than imprisonment. What if I stayed? Vorthak asked. Not as a prisoner or a tool, but as a friend. Someone who chooses to help because it's right, not because magical chains force me to. Jalen's face lit up with the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him in years. That would be amazing. But only if you really want to. Their bond, when it finally formed, was unlike anything in the Empire's history. Instead of master and servant, they became partners. Instead of power flowing from dragon to human, they created something new, a connection based on mutual respect and shared purpose. When they emerged from the Crimson Spire together, the waiting crowds fell silent in shock. Vorthak's eyes no longer burned with rage but with something far more powerful: hope. Jalen rode on the dragon's shoulder, not as a conqueror claiming his prize, but as a friend who had offered freedom and found partnership instead. The council members rushed forward with prepared speeches about coronations and imperial ceremonies, but Jalen stopped them with a simple gesture. The Empire's over, he announced calmly. We're going to try something better. What they built together in the months that followed transformed the galaxy. Instead of a rigid hierarchy maintained through fear and magical compulsion, they created a confederation where each world governed itself while working together for mutual benefit. Vorthak became what he had always been meant to be, a teacher and protector who chose to help rather than being forced to serve. The boy who had learned to fix broken machines became the leader who fixed broken systems, proving that sometimes the greatest revolutions start with simple acts of kindness.